With 2 weeks to go in this election race, polls continue to show the coalition losing ground. Support for Peter Dutton is slipping away in the very suburbs he's targeting, and time is running out. Early voting begins on Tuesday. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. Very happy Easter to all who are celebrating it this morning. It has been a quieter few days of campaigning over the holiday weekend. The two major parties yesterday were sticking to their traditional policy safe spaces. Peter Dutton promising tax breaks for small business, Anthony Albanese promising new laws to cement workers' rights to penalty rates. The week was dominated by much bigger offerings on housing, which were largely panned by economists and experts. The two leaders also clashed over regional security, with Peter Dutton admitting he made a mistake about the Indonesian president. And then there was the leaders' debate, which gave us some insight into their competing plans and some awkward moments too.
Week 3 of the campaign has housing squarely in the frame.
Both leaders now betting the House on attracting young home buyers.
Get ready, the rush for first-time buyers.
How good's that?
He's not welcome in our neighbourhood.
Moscow has reportedly requested Jakarta to station aircraft in an Indonesian province, less than 1,400 kilometres north of Darwin.
And we're seeking further clarification.
This would be a catastrophic failure of diplomatic relations.
We are seeking further information. We obviously do not want to see Russian influence in our region.
Did the Prime Minister know about this before it was publicly announced by the President of Indonesia?
President Prabowo had made no such announcement.
Russian warplanes will not be based in Indonesia.
Jakarta says it would never agree to such a proposal.
The Prime Minister has accused the opposition leader of extraordinary overreach.
He verbaled the President of Indonesia.
He's simply too aggro and too reckless to be the Prime Minister of Australia.
We're not going to apologise for having a strong leader that will stand up for national interests.
If the world wasn't watching, it is now.
Gentlemen, good evening.
The reference I was making shouldn't have been to the President. It was in relation to sources from the Prabowo government.
So was that a mistake?
It was a mistake.
Do you have any problem with investors using tax breaks to buy multiple properties?
Anthony, your government has modelled negative gearing changes and CGT changes.
Well,
the Treasurer has done that.
That's not right.
But that's not true.
From time to time, the public service provides us with views.
Treasurer Jim Chalmers concedes he asked Treasury for negative gearing modelling.
I sort of view. Now, that's different to commissioning modelling.
If you're going to abolish negative gearing...
Well, that's not what we're doing.
We're doing the planning for it now. Be upfront with the Australian people before they vote.
What we are doing is what we're putting before the Australian people.
The bottom line is, right now, we have two major parties that are working in the interests of property developers.
There will be no media conference today. I'll just be sitting here chilling.
That's a nice, beautiful afro. I'm jealous. I'm very jealous. I'm very jealous.
I'm going to take it back to the lodge. All sorts of space.
On your neck. Is that any good?
Lift it up and then just flip it like you put on.
Yeah, that's great.
An Easter lull after 3 weeks of hectic campaigning.
Pictures are plenty, but unsurprisingly, policy and raw politics took a pause.
Yeah, no, a bit of a quieter day today.
A reminder, we're running extended 90-minute editions through the campaign. And my guests this morning are the Shadow Minister for Housing and the NDIS, Michael Sukkar, and the Greens leader, Adam Bandt. First, let's check what's making news. And the campaign is in something of a hiatus over Easter. Both leaders visited the Royal Easter Show in Sydney yesterday for some animal encounters and show bags. Sadly, no rides or Dagwood dogs. And in the Nine papers, the Coalition is accusing Labor of reviving its Medicare falsehoods by claiming a Dutton government would cut funding for almost 90 urgent care clinics. The Coalition's committed to retaining all existing clinics, but it's not promised to fund a further 50 announced by the government in the budget. Well, unless all the polls are completely wrong, Peter Dutton is in trouble with 2 weeks to go in this campaign. Some surveys suggest his nuclear power plan has not gone down well. Others point to voters wanting stability at a time of great global volatility. The coalition has clearly taken a risk in leaving much of its policy until the last minute. We're still waiting, for example, to hear what it would do on defence. Early voting begins the day after tomorrow. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this Easter Sunday by Karen Middleton, Epstein, Clare Armstrong. Great to see you all. Thanks for joining us. Let's hope those Easter eggs survive the next 90 minutes. Karen, let's start on housing because it was the big issue of the week. Certainly started with the campaign launches last Sunday. Big housing announcements from both Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton. At the end of the week, how do you think these big policies washed out? Did either one come out on top on housing or did they cancel each other out?
I think there was a lot of scrappiness through the week. We had three head-to-head debates between the Minister Clare O'Neill and her Shadow Minister Michael Sukkar.
One of them got pretty willing.
One of them got very willing on 7:30. So I think a bit of it got lost in all the argument over numbers and who lied and who didn't and all of that. But I think economists have ended up saying that perhaps it's the Labor measure that has more of a demand side, supply side impact, and that there is concern that a lot of these measures, including some of what Labor is promising, is more on the demand side and less on the supply side, and supply is where they really need it. So the money that they've promised to start to help facilitate the development of homes is a supply side measure. I think what the coalition has proposed in terms of tax concessions for first home buyers, taking out a mortgage on a new home, will be very attractive to people who have already got a deposit together or who are likely to get a deposit together. That those people are the ones who are targeted there. It's the people struggling to get a deposit together who would benefit most from what Labor is promising by extending that access to a loan with just 5% deposit.
And Raf, it was pretty unequivocal from the experts and the economists, wasn't it, that these are dumb and dumber policies. They like the supply side measures to build more homes, but the stuff that's going to pump up demand got a big thumbs down, didn't it?
I think Saul Estake's line was, it's a dumpster fire of dumb ideas, which sums up how the economists feel. I do think Labor's got one thing in their corner. There's not as many people who might take up a 5% deposit idea as people who might benefit from superannuation and a concession on your mortgage. Maybe there's more people who might be able to access their super. I think the biggest problem the coalition has is, what is that policy? So my shorthand for that would be negative gearing for first-time home buyers. Where is the three-word slogan that describes that policy? I did look at the Herald Sun website, just as an example, Tuesday afternoon. So we've had both housing launches. Where are the housing policies? Does Anthony Albanese need a housing policy as much as Peter Dutton? Probably not. The 14th headline, after things about the Liberal in Victoria, John Pizzuto, and a shop called Culture Kings, was Peter Dutton's mistake. So that gives you an idea. And it's not a criticism of the Herald Sun. They're giving their readers what they want. Yeah. The ideas didn't penetrate. Where's the three-word slogan that describes the discount on your mortgage? I don't think a lot of people who use negative gearing as a landlord can give you a good, concise explanation for how it works. So how on earth can Liberal MPs provide, hey, this is our thing?
Yeah.
I'd put a bit of meat on those bones and say we actually sent out a cadet on Monday morning, the day after the two launches, to ask people on the street what they thought of the two policies. And at the end of the day, the poor kid came back and said, honestly, no one could understand what I was talking about. And that's a big problem when you see it in even some of the social media content that the coalition are producing now. There isn't a succinct way to talk about tax deductibility of your mortgage interest repayments for the first 5 years, up to $650,000 of your mortgage. But
is this just, sorry to butt in there, is this another example of where having this out much earlier would have helped? Of course.
I think with the benefit of hindsight, and I would caveat this by saying that I don't believe that these policies were developed at the time that I'm now suggesting, but if you had a situation where even, for example, the gas reservation, you'd have thought budget reply 2023, you're still in the midst of the gas shortage, that's a real differentiator on energy from the government immediately. You could have spent 2 years talking to the gas companies, making it seem feasible. Similarly, a year ago, if you want to start talking about some kind of structural change to help first home buyers. I mean, in defence of both parties, just coming back to the supply question though, they are trying to get everyone to look at their packages as a whole.
They do have supply measures.
They do have supply measures. And these kind of sugar hit engage young voters with their demand right in the campaign. It does sort of make sense. But I think both sides, maybe Labor's come out a little bit on top on this. There hasn't really been a narrative.
I did speak to one independent expert, Tim Lawless, who quite liked the coalition's supply side measure, the $5 billion fund to help with the last mile infrastructure stuff. Then we saw, Karen, Peter Dutton's son Harry emerge on the campaign trail. For a couple of days he was with him. They visited building sites. He's a 20-year-old apprentice carpenter. And on one of the campaign visits, he actually took a question on his personal struggles to buy a home at the age of 20.
I am saving up for a house, and so is my sister Beck and a lot of my mates, but as you've probably heard, it's almost impossible to get in the current state. So, I mean, we're saving like mad, but it doesn't look like we'll get there.
So, Karen, this drew a lot of attention. There were questions, well, hang on, is Mum and Dad going to help you buy the house? It took a day to get that admission that, yes, they will.
Yeah.
Just, there's a bit to explain here. Why would Peter Dutton have his son there in the first place?
A couple of reasons. It softens him. You know, he has his family around him. You know, he's got his son there. That's probably helps him relax a little bit. And it's the humanising thing that we're always talking about that they are striving for with Peter Dutton. And they're also trying to engage younger voters. And so Harry is in that category. So you can understand why. But it had a risk attached to it. You know, a 20-year-old with a dad who we understand has a property portfolio of about $30 million, talking about how hard it is to get into the market. There are a lot of 20-year-olds who aren't quite at that point yet, even thinking about real estate for a start. But the obvious question was, well, the Bank of Mum and Dad, that's the whole issue. We know it's something like the 9th biggest lender in the country is the Bank of Mum and Dad.
Yeah, that's right.
He was always going to get the question. So it was a big decision to have this son there rather than having someone who wasn't part of the family talking about it. And then to not be able to answer that question, I think that was a misstep and it didn't go well.
Yeah, look, to be clear, I think they've sold all those properties, but we don't know how much is in the trust fund and so on. But look, clearly there's money there to help the kids, as Peter Dutton confirmed.
Yeah,
so what
was interesting for me is, I was at the Liberal launch, and one of the kind of points that Peter Dutton was trying to make there is that he doesn't want this to become a country where the only way into the housing market is via the Bank of Mum and Dad.
That's right, and that's what he should have said.
It was bizarre to me that he didn't sort of have that answer prepared when, you know, you've sort of set yourself up to be asked it.
When I go to supermarkets, which is what I always go to in a marginal seat, someone tells you, you know, they no longer buy the cut of meat they used to buy, or they don't even buy meat. And I always ask at the end, do you think Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese understand what life is like for you? Invariably, a good half of people say no, they've got no idea. Nothing says, I am not like everyone else, more than wheeling out your son. Like, Peter Dutton's done well, good luck to him. The son's saving up early, good luck to him. Nothing says you are not like the voters who are struggling, more than, oh, do you reckon Dad can help out the son? That's just another thing, and it's not an Albanese Dutton, it's not a partisan issue, it's this man can afford to help his son. I can't. I just think that has blaring red lights all over it, and he had two complex ideas the day before. He had his mortgage concession idea and a tax offset that no one's heard about. They're two complex things. It's obvious he's going to get asked, are you going to help your son? That's bad politics, I think.
Then we got to the leaders' debate Wednesday night. Housing was obviously a hot topic there. Asked them both about negative gearing, capital gains tax, the tax breaks for property investors, and to put it bluntly, they both said, no, we're not touching it. We think that's going to hurt supply if we were to wind back those tax breaks. But Peter Dutton did go in pretty hard on this point.
Anthony, your government has modelled negative gearing changes and CGT changes.
Well,
the Treasurer has done that.
That's not right.
Well, it is
the public
actually
service.
right.
Well, under our public service, we actually value the public service, and we value them coming up with ideas and doing assessments. That's what's happened.
So the public service coming up with assessments. Did they come up with assessments of their own accord, or were they asked to come up with assessments by the Treasurer? Well, here's Jim Chalmers.
You know, I've said on a number of occasions now that I sought a view. Now, that's different to commissioning modelling. The Prime Minister was asked about commissioning modelling. I sought a view.
Raf, two very, very different things.
Look, their line is that advice is simple, modelling is complex. We only asked for the advice because we wanted to prove that actually negative gearing doesn't improve supply.
Yeah, but
Dutton landed a blow, right? That is a
should
that
the PM
blow.
Was the PM, giving the false impression there that they had nothing to do with?
I think Peter Dutton knew what the answer was going to be. So, like, he lands a blow, he gets them talking about it. I do think there are very senior people in Labor who are like, well, actually, it's not so bad if people think we're in favour of negative gearing. But the negative gearing cudgel was created by Labor. They ran around the country in 2016 and 2019 saying,
we've got to do something, we've got to do something.
Sort of hands.
But at the end of the day, Wouldn't it be helpful to have some Treasury modelling on negative gearing, every few years?
Well, again, there was a response you could give that was clearer than the one that Anthony Albanese gave. Jim Chalmers did a much better job the next day. Whether you believe it or not, he delivered it better. And the problem for the Prime Minister in the way he answered is that it opened up one of those sub-themes or, overriding themes that the coalition is going for, which is he's slippery, he's tricky, he's not telling the truth, that allowed that to be created and that to run into the following day, and that was where the problem was.
Yeah, but Claire, to the point, the Treasury, the experts, wouldn't it be helpful for the public debate to see every now and then what these tax breaks are costing?
I absolutely agree. I would love to see that modelling because we still haven't, after all these, it's been 12 months of reporting about since we learned of its existence in the 9 papers. I would just say the PM sometimes has this tendency to go to the answer he thinks that's going to cut off the issue, but by just denying it outright, saying, no, that's not right. It would have been easier to say, yeah, we got the answer and the answer proves the evidence base is now stronger in our side. It's going
to have a negative effect if we touch it. But look, I'm curious what you think the view is within Labor on this, because I note that Jim Chalmers, whenever he's asked, says, what's his language? We're not proposing any change to negative gearing.
And that's portrayed as leaving it open
Well,
for
it kind
the
of
future.
sounds like what we heard on stage 3 tax cut changes for a long time. We have no plans.
Well,
we're not
there's
proposing.
a constituency within Labor and Labor supporters who do think that it shouldn't exist and that it's not fair and that it's part of the problem with people not being able to get into the housing market because so many people are investing, etc. So there is a constituency for that. So they're trying to cover all bases and not rule it out completely, but they don't want to be totally arbitrary about it. But then that leaves the issue hanging, doesn't it?
Well, there's 2 really triggering things if you ask any Labor MP, right? Rudyard Rudd, and then the consecutive words negative gearing and dividend imputation, right? And it's just extreme PTSD if you mention those things. So I think there is
franking credits, yes.
Yes, so there is there's an allergy to that.
You don't think there's any appetite to go back to looking at something like this?
I think it depends who you ask. But I think most people I know we'll talk about the campaign later. Yeah. They feel like things are doing well. The last thing they want to do
Don't raise it now. No, exactly. Well, the Greens, we know, are very keen on having some change to negative gearing and capital gains tax as a key demand in any hung parliament. And some other independents, including David Pocock, also want the 2 major parties to embrace some more serious reform here.
What the major parties are missing is some long-term thinking and some courage to actually take on these challenges. And it seems like their whole election strategy is to basically say, well, we're slightly better than the other bunch.
If we do end up with a hung parliament, is there likely to be more pressure and movement on something like this, Claire?
Yes, and I think the people in the Labor Party, that there are people in the caucus who'd be quite happy to have that conversation, and all the better if it's sort of taken out of their hands and there's a scapegoat conveniently
we have to do it.
Enters the conversation. I will say, though, the Greens have labelled just about every one of their policy demands a priority in a minority government. So at some point we're going to need a priority within the priority list, because it's becoming really unclear which
core
is
and
the
non-core, I think, is the phrase that comes to mind. Yeah.
We're going to hear from Adam Bandt a little later on. Time now to talk to the Shadow Minister for Housing and the NDIS, Michael Sukkar. Now, yesterday, the Shadow Finance Minister, Jane Hume, was quoted in the 9 papers saying the Coalition's plan to end work from home for public servants was still a good policy. It just hadn't found its appropriate time. Labor jumped on that.
Jane Hume has said that she thinks that stopping people from working from home is a good policy. It just wasn't the appropriate time. Now, when the Liberal Party say it's not the appropriate time, you know what that means. They think the right time to change this is after the election. The Liberal Party haven't changed. They're just pretending now. They're just pretending, trying to con people into voting for them.
Michael Sukkar, welcome to the program.
Morning, David.
And a very happy Easter.
You too.
Do you agree with Jane Hume? Is ending work from home for public servants a good idea in principle?
Well, no, we've made very clear, David, that our views are that clearly work from home and flexible working arrangements since COVID, admittedly with the necessity of COVID, is a feature of our public service now. And there are many ways in which we can ensure productivity in the public service, as I think taxpayers would expect. But My view, and I've made this very clear in recent interviews, David, is we need to be attracting the best possible people to our public service. And I don't think we want to do anything that disincentivises really good people who do value flexible working arrangements.
So touching work from home rules is not a good idea in any circumstance?
We've made very clear, David, we have left that behind. We've heard very clearly, and we absolutely, on behalf of taxpayers, want to ensure we've got the best possible public service. I think that requires the best possible people, and I would expect that requires flexible working arrangements.
Let's turn to housing, your portfolio. We were just talking about negative gearing. Joe Hockey once famously argued that there should be some winding back of negative gearing. Scott Morrison, as Treasurer, received Treasury advice on negative gearing that he ultimately rejected. What's wrong with hearing from the experts at Treasury on these tax breaks?
Well, I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong. I think what's wrong, David, is the Prime Minister denying it. He denied to you. He looked down the barrel of a camera to millions of Australians and he flat out denied that it happened. The next day, Treasurer Jim Chalmers came out and rebuked him and made very clear that he had sought that advice, and then it went even further when the Housing Minister confirmed that they had looked at all options. So if the government is planning to abolish negative gearing and change CGT after the election, they've just got to come clear with the Australian people. We know they're itching to do it. As you quite rightly pointed out earlier, David, they went to 2 elections vehemently arguing for it. So we know they want to do it, and perhaps a minority government with the Greens will give them the opportunity to do what we know they want to do, and that's abolish negative gearing and alter CGT.
On these tax breaks, on the policies themselves, you don't own as many properties as some politicians, but I think you own a few. Why does someone like you need these sort of tax breaks?
Well, you're making assumptions there, David. A lot of people who own investment properties are positively geared. They're not by any means.
So you're not a negative. You're not a negative gearer.
Well, I'm just making the point. A lot of people who own properties are actually in positive gearing territory.
Are you?
I'd have to check my tax returns, David. I think I'm probably in positive gearing territory, although with rates increasing, who knows? The point is, though, David, if you
you don't know if you're negative gearing.
No, of course I know, David.
So what are you negative gearing or not?
Let's just make it very clear, David. I own a 1-bedroom apartment in Canberra that I live in for about half the year when I'm in Canberra. I'm not negatively gearing that property, so that's very clear.
But another property?
No, David, I'm not.
You're not negative gearing a property?
No, my properties are positively geared, but I didn't come on here to talk about
that's
my
fine.
personal circumstances.
But why does someone on a higher income need these sort of tax breaks?
Well, David, the point here is it's a feature of our tax system. If you have an investment, you're entitled to offset losses from one investment into other forms of income that you've got. It's just a standard feature of our tax system. Now, if we look at it very closely, and it has been looked at in the past, where you tax housing more, you get fewer homes and you get higher rents. So, for example, the NBA conducted very, very clear analysis that you'll have fewer homes built because of higher taxes and rents will increase. Now, that will be terrible for renters and terrible for first home buyers too, who in the end will have fewer homes to choose from.
Let's look at your plan announced a week ago to let first home buyers deduct mortgage payments from their tax bill. It will benefit those on higher incomes more. I think someone earning more than $240,000 a year would be able to claim $87,000 off their tax bill. Low income earners, the ones who are struggling to get into the market, they'd get around half that amount. How is that fair?
Well, I think if you ask somebody who's going to get, for example, that $40,000 tax benefit, David, they will take that every day of the week, because we know there are a couple of really big challenges for first home buyers. They can't service a mortgage and therefore they can't get finance, and the deposit hurdle is too high. Our plan is the only plan that seeks to address both, and not by providing them a grant, David, but by giving them some of their own tax back. And we do have a progressive tax system, so obviously the higher your tax bracket, the higher the effective rate of any deduction. But
that's what I'm asking about. Why you need to give the highest income earners, who might also get some help from the bank of mum and dad to the tune of who knows how much, why do they need $87,000 in tax relief?
Well, we've put in place income caps on the program, David. So unlike the Labor Party, who's removed income caps, we do have income caps in place. So ours is targeted.
Just remind us what they are.
175 for singles and 250 for couples, which is the same caps that we've got in place for our changes to the home guarantee scheme. So we're targeting it to that first home buyer cohort, and I can assure you any first home buyer, whether we're talking about the average, so an average couple on full-time incomes who will save $55,000 over those 5 years, being able to put that towards the repayments on their mortgage gets them through that difficult period, and is ultimately, David, going to convert Australians from renters into homeowners, and that's the entire objective of this policy.
And this policy, whichever way the election goes, should we remember this as Michael Sukkar's idea?
No, you should remember it as a coalition, an important coalition initiative as part of a suite of initiatives.
But do you own this? You champion this?
I'm very proud of this policy, absolutely. Well, of course, I'm the Shadow Housing Minister, David, but our policies are put forward by the entire coalition.
But was it your idea?
Well, I'm the Shadow Housing Minister. I've been the Shadow Housing Minister this entire term. So
I know that. Was it your idea?
Obviously had a lot to do with it, David. Yes, David, it's my idea. Good. I'm the Shadow Housing Minister. Right. So, but the ideas come from ministers. They then go through a very thorough process through our parties, and then they become part of our party platform. So, I mean, if you want to call it the Sukkar policy, I'd be very happy to, David, but it's really broader than that.
Now, on the supply side, you are promising a $5 billion fund to help with these last mile infrastructure connections to speed up the delivery of new homes. Are these going to be grants or loans?
They'll be predominantly grants, David. We'll provide the exact breakdown in the ordinary way when our costings are released. But look, the truth is grants will probably deliver the most bang for buck. And for your viewers, we're really talking about, when we say last mile infrastructure, the water, the sewage, the telecommunications and the roads. There are literally hundreds of projects around the country where you've got planning approval, all state approvals ready to go, but the homes can't be unlocked because there's no one who will fund the infrastructure. We want to step in and fund that infrastructure, and as I think the industry's made very clear to you and to many others, they view this as being probably the most important catalyst to get new supply into the market.
A couple of other things in the housing space. The fastest growing cohort of homeless Australians are women over the age of 55. I'm sure you know that. They may have fled domestic violence. They might need crisis accommodation. What are you taking to this election to help them?
Well, we'll continue to support the National Action Plan, which we started in government, and to this government's credit, they continued. This is really one of the few areas of bipartisanship, David. We brought in place a program, the Safe Places program. When we were in government, again, the government has continued the Safe Places program, which provides that sort of crisis accommodation. But also, the former government channelled a huge amount of funding into community housing providers, most of which have dedicated and specific projects for that cohort you're talking about, women older than 55, often with smaller superannuation balances, but not just for that cohort, but there is a lot targeted there.
But on top of that, of course, Labor's put in place the Housing Australia Future Fund, which you want to scrap. Now, this fund, just earlier this year, committed $100 million for 42 crisis accommodation projects. What would happen to some of these projects if you win?
Well, any projects that are underway will continue. I mean, that's not going to be affected. Obviously, we're very concerned with the Housing Australia Future Fund. It's underperformance, firstly. Its structure, secondly, and we obviously have seen reports in recent days that the fund itself is in potentially difficult circumstances because, again, what many of your viewers may not be aware is it's really dependent on returns from the stock market
like the
to
Future
fund it.
Fund, like all of these funds, even the ones you guys set up, they are dependent on what the market does. But the aim is over time, it delivers a return like the Future Fund that's invested in crisis accommodation as well as social and affordable housing. So what would you do if you're not going to provide that revenue for crisis accommodation?
Well, we will continue to deliver it. We'll just deliver funding directly. I mean, we've
from
got
the budget.
Housing Australia, well, as we've always done, David.
How much?
I mean, we've always delivered funding. Well, we'll continue to fund the affordable housing agreements to the states, which is $1.8 billion. We'll continue to fund the affordable housing bond aggregator, which sits within Housing Australia, which has delivered many of these homes. This is a sort of a structure that the government inherited, and again, they've continued. That will continue. I think that one thing we'll need to determine, though, David, is if we are to win on the 3rd, is what the position is of the HAF, because I must say the sector has been very unhappy with the process. A number of projects that have been chosen over others that missed out, which at their face value seem to be quite questionable. So, look, the basic position will be where you've got projects that are going ahead, of course they'll continue.
Look, I just wanted to ask you, I mentioned, it could be women fleeing domestic violence. I know this isn't your portfolio, but domestic violence is not an issue that's really featured much in this campaign at all, and yet women are still being killed at an alarming rate. What is the Coalition's plan to tackle this problem of domestic violence?
Yeah, look, I understand, David, there'll be a little more to say from the relevant shadow, Susan Lee, over the next couple of weeks. I mean, obviously we've committed huge amounts to, additional amounts to the Centre for Countering Child Exploitation, which is wrapped into many of these things. Obviously, from a housing perspective, we've been very focused on the National Action Plan and the Safe Places program that I've just spoken about, and trying to continue with some continuity the action plan that has been, yes, developed under the Coalition, taken up by the government, and continue. One thing we don't want to do here is chop and change too much, because so many of these programs continue. We have a Royal Commission into Indigenous communities and child exploitation, again wrapped into some of those issues, around the periphery. But I do understand we'll have a bit more to say about it. But I think we don't want massive changes to what has been a relative level of continuity between governments, because these programs have a long lead time.
Look, I want to turn to your other portfolio. You're the Shadow Minister for NDIS. We haven't heard much about the NDIS in this campaign either, to be fair. What are your plans for the NDIS?
Well, one of the reasons why that is the case, David, is that what I've tried to do as Shadow Minister is not have the NDIS as a political football. I think even my biggest critics would agree that we've tried to work in a really cohesive way with the government, push them where we need to, criticise them where we need to. We supported the previous round of quite significant legislative changes whilst Bill Shorten was Minister, and were able to get a whole lot of amendments through that bill that we wanted to see, and we're able to agree on it. So really we're at the point now, David, where there's a structure of quite significant changes to the NDIS. How they are implemented is going to really chart the course for the future. For example, foundational supports. I mean,
what's your view on that? I was going to ask you this. This is still an impasse between the Commonwealth and the states to set up foundational supports for kids who don't end up, therefore, on the NDIS. What needs to happen to break this impasse?
Well, David, I received a briefing from the department just last week, and it seems that there is some sort of impasse between the Commonwealth and the states, and I think in the end asking the states to step up and to try and assist those children is important, because what we won't accept in the Coalition is a cohort of young children with ASD or developmental delay being thrown off the NDIS and, in a sense, thrown to the wolves without a series of supports that are going to
how do you get them to step
ensure
up?
continuity.
How do you get the states to step up?
Well, again, if we win the election, we'll have to assume the negotiating position that we inherit. Now, I haven't been fully briefed on exactly whether those negotiations are, David. I've just gleaned from what I've been able to get from public and private information that there are different states in different positions. There are different states with a different appetite to step up. And I think the Commonwealth's going to need to require minimum standards, because what the Coalition won't do is throw a cohort of children with ASD or developmental delay off the scheme where there's nothing outside it to support them.
So just on that, do you want to see fewer kids with an autism diagnosis off the NDIS?
Well, we want to see people getting the appropriate support. One area where Bill Shorten and I absolutely agreed on was that at the moment, if you don't get access to the NDIS, there's zero support. And there is clearly a cohort of children who need an intermediate level of support, and that needs to be provided to them.
Okay. And when we hear the Coalition talk about wanting to save $7 billion a year in the public service, can you tell us this morning, will there be any cuts to the NDIS?
Well, no. The NDIS, obviously, it's growing at greater than 10% at the moment. The target is about 8.4%.
I think it was more than 20% when the Coalition was in government.
Yeah, no. The coalition, well, we took it from 50,000 people to 500,000 people. We obviously grew the scheme quite significantly from its inception to maturity. To get it to that 8.4, I've again been told by the department they're very confident that that can happen. But
is 8% low enough? Are you comfortable with that, or do you want to drive it down lower than 8%?
Well, I think we have to try and meet the targets as we get to them. At the moment, we've got a huge implementation schedule that we've sort of touched on that sort of flows from the legislation. I think a lot of the future growth in the NDIS will depend on some of those administrative decisions that now are at an agency level, including how plans are created, how they're structured, how the payments are made.
But in terms of the big picture,
is
8% growth enough, or do you want a lower rate of growth?
Well, I think if you look at the early actuarial studies, it didn't envisage that it would be that big.
What should it be?
But we've got to, at the moment, we are committed to the current trajectory.
What does at the moment suggest? So the families who might be worried about what you might do here, you're suggesting you might want even lower than 8% growth?
Well, David, you're asking me about things in the, distant future.
What your plans are after the election, yes.
No, because we've got a funding envelope now for the next 4 years. That is quite ambitious, though, I might say, to get growth down from where it is at the moment.
So no change for the next 4 years. Is that how families should interpret it?
No. Well, we have worked in a bipartisan manner on the NDIS. It's going to be hard to get it to the 8.4, David. Let's not underestimate how difficult that's going to be.
My question is, you want to go further than that. You want to cut
that's
further
ambitious.
Than that.
Well, no. What we want to do, David, is ensure that every single Australian who needs support from the government through the NDIS is able to get it. We don't want money wasted with fraud and foreign criminal cartels and gangs. That's what we want to stop. But we want to make sure that everyone who needs the support gets it. And again, to go back to my earlier point, that we don't throw off entire cohorts of potential NDIS participants, including young children with ASD, without having appropriate supports elsewhere.
Look, just a final question on how the campaign's going with now less than 2 weeks to go and early voting starting on Tuesday. We can see in all the polls support for the coalition's been dropping since the start of the campaign. Peter Dutton, we've seen, has admitted a couple of mistakes on work from home and Indonesia. Policies have been left very late in the piece. We still don't know the defence policy. You've seen a lot of campaigns. How would you honestly rate this one?
Well, David, I think we're running a campaign that's trying to connect with Australians when they're going to switch on. I understand why many in the media think policy should be out for months and months before an election. The truth is, in Australian politics, and I think this is quite a healthy thing about Australians, is they don't fixate on politics as you and I do, David. And so, in a sense, you want to ensure that they are hearing the message at the time that they are focused on the election. And really, we've seen that over the last couple of weeks. I expect people will be focusing a lot more narrowly over the next couple of weeks. I think the main series of policies that we've got are all out and all there to be ventilated. And to go to some of Clare and Raf's points, it's now our duty to rinse and repeat those messages and try and ensure they hit as many
when you look at the numbers,
as possible.
Do you think you'll win?
Oh, we're in it to win it, David. Absolutely, we are in it to win it, and I can assure you, there's no one on our side waving a white flag. If we, as we were in the 2019 election, if we were slaves to polls, we would have given up then.
All right, Michael Sukkar, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, David.
Coming up, we'll hear from the Greens leader, Adam Bandt, as well. Let's get back to our panel right now. We're joined again by Karen Middleton, Raf Epstein and Clare Armstrong. Look, just a couple of things to pick out of that, Karen. On the NDIS, we haven't heard a great deal during this campaign, and Michael Sukkar is probably right. There's been some bipartisanship around the reforms that did go through in this term of Parliament to bring down the growth. It's still growing, but flatten that curve, if you like, of growth in the cost of the NDIS. But what did you make of his comments there about where he wants to get to?
Two slightly conflicting things. He's saying there's a plan in place for the next 4 years. So that sounds like him saying we've got time, it's in place, and maybe he's saying that stays. But then he also says, casting some doubt on the 8% growth figure and whether maybe growth should be less than 8%, and that implies they might want to cut more. So I found that a little bit contradictory. I'm not clear what he was saying, whether they think they would try to pull it back or whether they would leave it in place for 4 years. He clearly is focused on people with autism spectrum disorder, and that is a group the government has focused on quite a lot, because the government has made the point, when Bill Shorten was Minister in particular, that the states have abdicated their responsibilities on that, and that they should be picking up those kinds of people, young people, and that the system, the national system, shouldn't be looking after people with autism. So he's trying to plug into that in particular.
And the government hasn't landed that agreement with the states yet on those foundational supports, has it? It is still up in the air a bit.
So I think the Prime Minister probably declared mission accomplished a little too early when he came out of that National Cabinet meeting over a year ago now, saying we're going to tie the agreement on the new 5-year hospital arrangement with getting states on board to fund these foundational supports. As we saw just before the election was called, because we're about to go into caretaker and hospitals were in a bit of trouble, the government had to agree to an interim 1-year hospital deal, about $1.7 billion extra for the state's hospitals. So it's really just kicked that down the road for another 12 months. Now, Health Minister Mark Butler says that he doesn't think that the states are leveraging these foundational supports to just keep getting this hospital funding, and that he's confident with where the foundational supports talks are. But it's pretty obvious that at this point, the states have got more hospital funding and are not yet on the hook for foundational supports.
How does this work, Raf? I mean, because you've got hospital agreements with the states, you've got school funding agreements with the states, you've still got to sort out these NDIS foundational support agreements with the states. Can they be done as a whole? Because you basically, at the end of the day, talking about pots of money going.
Well, they're trying to sell themselves as better managers of negotiations with the states, aren't they? So I think if you're on the NDIS, you care desperately about who's going to be the better manager. I don't find it easy myself personally to judge who is a better manager, primarily because they've each had stewardship of that at very different phases of it, which is something Michael said. But can I just pick up on one of the questions you asked Michael Sukkar about housing?
Sure.
Just because we had callers on the Wednesday morning, so people had time to digest the housing policy. Tabitha rang in, no longer owned a house because of domestic violence. More than half of her rent going on, more than half of her income going on rent, doesn't believe she's ever going to own a house. What savings she does have being chewed away by her rent. Michael Sukkar didn't actually give you a direct answer. There are a whole lot of things Labor's going to do, and one of the things they are going to do, and I think I'm right here, the 100,000 extra homes for first home buyers. If you haven't owned a house for 10 years, you actually can get onto that program. So that might suit someone like Tabitha. I'm just making that, I know that's a relatively complicated point to make, but people don't know enough about their housing policies. Does Tabitha have something that she can expect from Michael Sukkar? He hasn't been able to communicate it. And when you asked him, is it your policy? Yes, it's his. And I bet you what he wanted to say to you is, we should have been talking about this months ago.
And that's still people who have an ambition to buy, not people who are going to rent in perpetuity. And I think the Greens are really still the only people talking loudly about renters.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting to raise and important to raise. We have a lot of focus on the first home buyers, and fair enough, there is a problem there, inability to get into the market. But you've also got a significant cohort of particularly women, that might be fleeing violence and need crisis accommodation, and that can't be forgotten in any of this.
Can I give you one other caller? Frank rang. He's going to move into his sister's backyard, into the granny flat, because the rent's going up too much. It's $1,900 a month. He's thinking about moving to Vietnam. Wow. Because it's cheaper. He can't afford to live here. So there are a range of people that aren't being addressed.
A couple of other policy announcements yesterday I just want to touch on. Pretty quiet sort of Easter weekend on the campaign. Karen, we saw from the Coalition a small business policy, and from Labor they want to write into law workers' rights around penalty rates. What did you make of, is this sort of just a bit of filler over the weekend, or is this something with substance?
Oh, both were specifically tied to the Easter weekend and the people who were working. I think, those people are working, they may be paying more attention than people who are taking a break. So those policy announcements were announcements that the parties wanted to make and try and connect with people in their workplaces or where their mindsets were at the time. So they're taking the opportunity to have something to say over the Easter weekend, but it's not the big, broad policy statements that they want to be making when people are are paying more attention. And it's an interesting point that Michael Sukkar makes about the timing of their announcements. It was interesting to me that he was saying, oh, most of our big announcements are out, but he's obviously very focused on after Tuesday when voters are starting to vote pre-poll, and he clearly believes, and I think the coalition believes, and others too, and other parties, that people are starting to narrow their focus a little in the last week and a half and zoom in. And the question for the coalition is, are those kind of clear overriding messages out there with enough sort of firmness that people really understand what is being proposed? And that's the challenge for all the parties. You know, the policy has to be out there, the messages have to simplify. A lot of people make up their minds as they go into the polling booth. So you really want to be cutting through with very simple messages on the issues that people care about. And we know that far and away the biggest one is the cost of living.
Then you get these external issues that come along, and there was another one this week, a report in the defence news site Jane's about Russia apparently asking Indonesia if it could base some of its long-range military aircraft in Indonesia. Now, Peter Dutton jumped on this one. He called this a catastrophic failure of the Albanese government for not seeing it coming. It then emerged after a phone call between Richard Marles and his Indonesian counterpart that Indonesia said, no, they're not going to be basing any Russian planes here. But Peter Dutton, along the way, had wrongly suggested that this had been announced by the Indonesian president.
Did the Prime Minister know about this before it was publicly announced by the President of Indonesia? The reference I was making shouldn't have been to the President. It was in relation to sources from the Prabowo government.
So was that a mistake?
It was a mistake.
Claire, what happened here? Why was there misinterpretation, mistake around what the President of Indonesia had said?
So many things happened here. Well, I think to begin with, there was maybe a rush to frame this incident in a similar light to what happened in the 22 campaign, where the Solomon Islands kind of blindsided the Morrison government with signing an actual defence deal with China, which is obviously substantially more progressive.
Labor smashed them for it.
Yeah, it was really I don't think the Pacific has ever dominated a federal election quite so much as it did, particularly in those days. So I think there were some people in the coalition really eager to frame this issue immediately without all the facts present. I think defence and national security is generally a comfort area for Peter Dutton. And so it was an overreach, it was essentially a misspeak. And to be honest, the first time he said it on afternoon briefing, I felt like he almost could see in the moment that he'd gone too far. What was strange was that the next morning in the press conference, he didn't clean it up. And I know a lot has been said, he obviously did in the debate that night, but I know a lot has been said about whether Peter Dutton was match fit, whether he should have been fronting the Canberra press pack a lot more over his last 3 years as opposition leader. But for me, it's not even really about the intensity or the complexity of the questions you might get from a Canberra press pack to being out elsewhere in the country. It's that consistency of you're actually being held to account for something you said 24 hours earlier. And in his general approach to the last 3 years, there have been set weekly media appearances interspersed with some other things every now and then. But I think this is an example where he just wasn't really nimble enough to respond to something that he'd done within 24 hours.
Can I just add to that? So the criticism, I guess, is that Peter Dutton hasn't done his homework. That is something Labor people will say. If you look at Peter Dutton's Lowy speech, excuse me, he didn't mention the word Indonesia. I don't think he mentions ASEAN. And he's also made a real departure. John Howard, Kevin Rudd, Morrison, Abbott, Turnbull, they all went to Indonesia first. Yep. Peter Dutton has said he would do something different and go to the United States. I don't know if that leads to that mistake, but it doesn't leave you in good stead to be across information. Jane's is a very reputable website. There's no reason to doubt the report.
And I was going to say,
need to go that.
No, I think they're standing by their story, and I think there's obviously something going on between Indonesia and Russia. They're doing defence exercises together. They're obviously. Their cooperation.
They're a line mover. I mean, Russia and Indonesia forever.
So I think it's important to say that that Labor is lucky that Peter Dutton made this mistake, because I think it did have the potential to be a repeat of 2022, where the blindsiding of the Morrison government over that security agreement in the Solomons. The government did appear to be caught a little off guard by this report. It is a reputable website. So I don't doubt that the report itself was right. And what we've heard from the government is the response has been, well, it's not happening, it's not happening. The language is quite careful. They're not saying they didn't ask for it. They're saying the Indonesians aren't doing it. And it was interesting to me that Richard Marles had to call his counterpart. If you already know this isn't happening, maybe you're doing it for show so you can say, I've just had a conversation. But the fact that you needed to call your counterpart to get reassurance just tells me that it did catch them a little bit by surprise.
But I think that's a fairly understandable thing to do, though, right, at that point. If you're able to, ring and say, is this happening or not?
Sure, but they were also trying to say, we knew it wasn't happening, it was never happening. Right. So which is it? Was it never happening, or did we have to double check?
And what is basing aircraft? What is,
having them fly and have a
We have, US troops in the top end who aren't technically based there, but they're rotated through. So all of this, there's something going on.
But also, it's a mistake made in a week where how many people know that Peter Dutton has dropped his work from home policy? A lot of people know he doesn't like work from home. How many people know that he has actually dropped that policy while he's also trying to sell housing policy?
Everything else.
So it's not the world's worst mistake, but it's another grab.
I'll show you what Labor did with it. This is what Labor did with it, to Karen's point about how they maybe got lucky with the mistake and really weaponised it.
Peter Dutton is too aggro and too reckless to be Australia's Prime Minister.
Peter Dutton's humiliating concession shows just how risky and reckless he is.
He was shooting from the hip. I cannot overstate how dangerous that is in terms of managing our bilateral relations.
So this goes to the point I was making earlier, but in the reverse. So the mistake Albanese made about the modelling on negative gearing allowed the coalition to make another point about him being slippery. Yeah. This is allowing the government, the Labor Party, to make a point that they like to make about the leader and the whole coalition. They're not ready for government. They're doing policy on the run. They're incompetent. All of these things. These mistakes have a secondary purpose and sometimes a larger purpose in political terms for their opponents.
I would just add with Labor, they're obviously very competent, well, you can debate, but they come across as pretty competent on international relations generally. Obviously, Penny Wong's done a lot of work over the last 3 years. I find that they have a tendency to not necessarily, like the PM in particular on this, to not necessarily just bring it back to basics and step people through that. And you had that knee-jerk reaction from Labor as well, saying, oh, we're seeking clarity, like, get out of our faces. We're sort of like, we're getting there, we're learning of this as you are. And so I don't think it was unreasonable of the coalition to jump on that to begin with, because I don't think Labor were as careful as they could have been initially in responding to the early questions about what had gone on, whether the request had been made, regardless of the outcome of that request.
Yeah, look, just to wrap this topic up, Peter Dutton, at the end of the day, clearly shot from the hip, overreached, had to admit the mistake. And this is meant to be his strength, as you say, defence and national security. Does he learn from that, do you think?
I think there are people on his own side who worry that he's not confident. They will say to you that there was a lull after the cyclone. I know this is away from foreign policy and to the campaign, but does it damage his confidence? Because there are some people on his own side who doesn't feel he is displaying the confidence. I mean, he's a bit like a carnivore who's being fed a vegetarian diet. There's not much sort of let Dutton be Dutton. There is a feeling that he's a bit restrained and sometimes not talking about the things that he wants to talk about. And I do think if he makes a mistake like that, maybe that feeds that cycle. I don't know that that's happening, but people on his side.
And I want to come back to some general observations on where we're at in this campaign and how the leaders are performing. I want to get to Adam Bandt, though, and return to the housing debate briefly, because the Greens are saying that negative gearing reform will be a key demand, as Clare says, one of the key demands in any hung parliament. Time to talk to the Greens leader and to take us there. Here was the Prime Minister insisting he won't be negotiating with the Greens.
We have our housing policy that we are taking forward. The Greens, I am not negotiating with the Greens. We make it very clear. And what's more, the Greens have said the one non-negotiable thing that they have, by the way, is that they won't support Peter Dutton. It's somewhat amusing to me sometimes that people who are very hostile to the Greens seem so obsessed by talking them up and talking up their influence.
Adam Bandt, welcome to the program.
Hi, David.
So
Happy Easter.
Yeah, and to you. Despite the Prime Minister saying there that he's not going to negotiate with the Greens, you're actually writing today to the head of Treasury and the head of the Prime Minister's department to start preparing for negotiations, essentially. Tell me what you're suggesting.
Well, before every election, the officials prepare a red book and a blue book in the case of either side winning. I think this election, the red book and blue book are going to be pretty light reading, more pamphlets rather than detailed policy prescriptions in this battle of the band-aids that we've been seeing. But look, we've got a third of the country, less than a third of the country voting for the government, a bit more than a third voting for the opposition, and about a third is now voting for someone else. And with the experts saying we're heading for a minority parliament, every chance of that, we're saying that let's, given that we know that the departments are looking at things like negative gearing and capital gains tax, let's do the work now to put some of those, get the policy work done so that we can put some of those ideas on the table and have a discussion about them in the early days of the next parliament.
I think you've suggested this should be called a green book, but to be fair, it would also, I assume, have to include the ideas of Bob Katter, Di Lee, Helen Haynes, Rebecca Sharkey, One Nation. Would it be a multicoloured book?
Well, I think what we're seeing at the moment is very little policy being put forward by either Labor or Liberal. We saw the housing launches and we saw experts within a matter of 24, 48 hours condemning them for coming up with policies that are going to make the housing crisis worse. And I think one of the things we're seeing, part of the reason you're seeing this third of the country now saying we want someone else, is that the ideas for reform that are going to make the country better are in fact now coming from the crossbench. And so, yes, so some of those border ideas are going to get an airing in a minority parliament.
So basically, just to be clear on this, you want Treasury to cost the whole lot. It'd be quite a voluminous book that they'd have to produce.
Well, look, we're going to this election with a social democratic platform, and it's a broad social democratic platform, one I think that Whitlam would be proud of. It stands in stark contrast to the tinkering around the edges from the others. We're putting forward a suite of policy options funded by making the big corporations pay their fair share of tax, but we have identified some priorities, and one of those is the one that you mentioned, and that's what we're asking them to look at.
Let's have a look at negative gearing now. Your plans are to basically say new investors don't get negative gearing or capital gains tax breaks. Existing investors get to keep one property negatively geared. Some analysts fear this would drive investment away. It would damage supply. What do you say to that criticism of this sort of idea?
So let's talk about why we're doing this and then also what our policy is. Back in the 1980s, the average home cost 3 times the average income, and now it's 8 and rising. And in the late 1990s, John Howard, with a capital gains tax discount, really lit a fire under the housing market, put a big time bomb there. And as a result, there's now $180 billion over the decade in handouts going to property investors. And what that means is that a first home buyer or a renter, they turn up to an auction with whatever they've been able to save. They know but next to them is a wealthy property investor who's got a big cheque from Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton, able to keep bidding the price up, knowing that they can write it off on tax. So what we're saying is we need to ensure that younger generations have the same chance at owning a home as previous generations have. How would we do it? We've got to really, I guess, diffuse this time bomb in a way that's fair, because there'll be a lot of people who might have one investment property. They've done that perhaps on the advice of their accountants. It's preparing for their retirement. We're saying allow people with one, in addition to the family home. If you've got one investment property, the existing arrangements apply. But in the future, look, if you've got 2 to 200 investment properties, you can pay the same tax as everyone else has to. You shouldn't expect a tax handout from the government for that.
Okay, but how much wiggle room is there here in what you're suggesting? You talk about not diffusing the time bomb immediately, giving it time, because I assume you don't want to hurt supply or drive up rents is the other concern here, that if investors quickly vacate the market or can't negative gear, they'll have to push up the rent. Would you be willing to stretch that timeline so that it is being phased out over a longer period of time?
Look, we're willing to consider any good ideas about how to do this, and this is part of the reason that we're saying that it'd be good for the public service to start the work on this now. But can I say, this is, for us, there's three things that need to be done. One is winding back those handouts in the way that's fair. The second is start to put caps on rent increases, like we've got that in the ACT at the moment. And the third is build more homes that can be rented out at affordable rates. And we think the government that has for so many years been neglecting public housing, if they get back into the market and build lots of homes that people can afford to rent and buy, that deals with those issues you've raised.
A few other things. Your dental care policy, the Parliamentary Budget Office costed this one at $45 billion, but warned this was highly uncertain. It also said it was highly uncertain whether there would be enough dentists to meet demand. Wouldn't phasing this one in make more sense as well?
Well, and in fact, in that costing, that's basically what they've said would happen. It would take a while, based on international experience and based on their modelling. As people found out about the scheme, utilisation stepped up, so it would in fact slowly step up. But look, we know the main reason that people are avoiding going and seeing the dentist at the moment is cost. There will be some areas, of course, where it might be difficult to find a dentist, but the main reason is cost. And in a wealthy country like ours, we think that people should be able to afford to go and see the dentist. So one of the other things, we conducted a Senate inquiry into this that looked at things including the workforce, and one of the key messages that came back from that was that people were not choosing dentistry because of the massive debts they'd be left with, and we want to fix that as well with free education.
I wanted to ask you on gas. Do you welcome Peter Dutton's plan for an East Coast gas reservation?
Well, it's a pretty astounding admission from Peter Dutton, finally accepting that Australia does not have a gas shortage. Like, Australia is awash with the stuff. And what we know is we send about 4 times as much overseas as is used domestically. A lot of that goes tax-free. They don't even pay for the gas in the first place. But there's a much simpler solution than what Peter Dutton's proposing, which is just stop big corporations like Santos from dipping into the domestic market to fulfil future contracts. Do that, and you don't need to open up new gas fields, which is what Peter Dutton wants to do. You reserve enough here while we make the transition out of gas and into renewables, because Peter Dutton's plan is actually really a fig leaf for fast-tracking new coal and gas projects and opening up new gas mines, and we don't agree with that.
Nonetheless, it would see more of that export gas kept in Australia, wouldn't it? We're talking 50 to 100 petajoules. Wouldn't that be something you'd support?
Well, our approach is this. At the moment, the big corporations are dipping into what's available to households and businesses to the tune of about 22 petajoules just for overseas contracts. That amount is going to rise to over 200 petajoules over the next few years. So we're just saying, like, don't raid households and businesses just because you want to sell it overseas tax-free at enormous prices. Stop doing that. We don't need to open up new gas mines as Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese want to do.
I want to ask you, Adam Bandt, about your approach to this campaign. We've seen you wandering around with a big toothbrush. We've seen you with a big novelty check. We've seen you DJing a couple of nights ago at a nightclub there in Melbourne. The tone seems to be from the Greens a lot more fun than we had last year from the Greens, where you were going hard at Labor over housing, but also over Gaza. You were accusing the Prime Minister constantly of being complicit in genocide. We don't hear a lot from the Greens in this campaign about the Gaza issue, even though the war is ongoing. Why have you shifted gears?
Lots of things in that question, David. But look, at the moment, a lot of people are disengaged from politics. And when you look at this battle of the Band-Aid, the contest between the timid and the terrible at the moment, you can understand why. Like, they're not trying to tackle the big issues people are facing. They come out with a housing policy and the experts say it's going to make it worse.
But I'm just coming to your campaign, if we can. Sorry.
Yeah,
the question's about your campaign and why you're not really talking about Gaza and accusing the Prime Minister of the things you were last year. Is it because of that Queensland election result towards the end of the year where the Greens did have a disappointing night?
No, it's not. And to say two things. One is that because a lot of people are at the moment turning away from the major parties, we make no apologies for taking efforts to go and get people's attention. And if that involves going to a nightclub with a big toothbrush to advance our push to get dental into Medicare, then I'm happy to do it, because a lot of people don't see politicians tackling the big issues. In terms of those other issues that you're talking about,
Gaza.
The Greens. Well, we've been very, very clear. Like, we were clear at the time that we cannot be supporting an invasion of an area half the size of Canberra with 2 million people walled into it with nowhere to go. If you do that, it is going to lead to a slaughter. It gives me absolutely no pleasure at all that over the course of the last year, the things that we've been saying would happen have happened. We've got Amnesty International now saying it is a genocide. We've seen the ceasefire now ended. We take a simple proposition on this, David. Like, we condemned the attacks on October 7 and have called for the hostages to be released, but we also don't think children should be killed by a very sophisticated and well-armed army.
I understand your position on that. I'm just curious that you're not laying as much blame at the feet of the Australian government, of Anthony Albanese, as you were last year. Did you overreach on this last year, and have you had to shift course?
No, and if you have a look now, you see with the situation getting potentially even worse, people are crying out for our government to do something. Like, the Australian government was very outspoken, including with our support, when Russia invaded the Ukraine, and we did things. We took steps to put pressure on that to stop. And the Australian government is not putting any pressure on this, on the extremist Netanyahu government for this slaughter to stop. And we're arguing very simply that Israelis and Palestinians both should have equal rights to live in peace and justice and have their rights to self-determination respected.
I think others would point out the relationship between the Australian government and Israel has been damaged somewhat. Just finally on this one, do you think Australia is complicit in genocide?
I think Australia's engaging in a two-way arms trade with Israel. You've got now arrest warrants that we've got. Well, no, they don't. There's the Bombay doors, those parts that are being made in the F-35s are made here in Australia. You have a look at the government's language, and it's very, very careful language. Look, we're just saying
you've dropped the line about being complicit in genocide.
Look, David, you've got Amnesty International saying that a genocide is occurring. You've got now arrest warrants being issued for the extremist Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It's different to blaming
Anthony Albanese for being complicit in this.
Well, we're saying the government should do something. When you see a genocide occurring, as Amnesty International, as the experts are saying, then you want the Australian government to actually do something and to speak out for peace.
Now, just finally on the campaign itself, the Greens did well at the last election 3 years ago. You won 3 extra seats in Brisbane. There's a lot of focus on them and whether you'll be able to hold them. Labor's very confident, for example, they're going to pick up Brisbane. How confident are you that you'll be able to hold all 3 of those seats?
Look, having been through this myself, I know the first time around, you take nothing for granted. You have to work incredibly hard. This time we've got Labor, Liberal and Advance and the billionaires all coming after us. We expect that. But look, going into this final fortnight, can I say we've got a bit of a spring in our step. Like, we've been pushing for years for housing and first home buyers and renters to be on the agenda. Now it is, and you see from the experts that what the major parties are offering is going to make the housing crisis worse. I think at the moment the feeling that we're getting on the doors, which is being matched by the commentary about the policies, is that people understand we can't keep voting for the same 2 parties and expecting a different result. They're going to make things worse. Our challenge at the moment, I guess, over these last 2 weeks is to get our policies in front of people, because we know that when we do, we put things like dental into Medicare, making childcare free, ending native forest logging, fixing the housing crisis. People like it and they agree with us.
Adam Bandt, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, David.
All right, we're going to look at the Greens' prospects, how they're going in those 3 Brisbane seats in a moment. Let's get back to the panel, Karen Middleton, Raph Epstein and Clare Armstrong. So I did find that interesting on Gaza there, Karen. It's not quite the same language that we heard last year, is it?
No, it's much quieter, and it's not voluntarily discussed. You know, he answered when you asked the question, but he was more careful in his language, and I think you're right. We have seen a change in the Greens' approach to the issues they're talking about and what they're emphasising. They've gone much harder against Peter Dutton than they have against Anthony Albanese and Labor, generally speaking. So that's a change because I don't think it went very well for them.
Yeah, look, and we'll come back to how they're looking in Brisbane and potentially elsewhere. They have some other target seats thereafter, but they've primarily got to defend those 3 seats they won. Just on tax, we've had a bit of a debate about negative gearing and so on, but when it comes to personal income tax, there was a curious comment from Peter Dutton the other day about his aspiration to get rid of bracket creep. This means indexing the tax thresholds, the brackets, to the inflation rate. So when inflation goes up, the tax rates, thresholds automatically go up. So no longer does bracket creep exist. But it's not a promise at this election. It is just an aspiration.
It's an aspiration for us because I want to clean up Labor's mess, and I want to make sure that we can, as John Howard did, pay down Labor's debt and get ourselves into a position where we can have a tax system which is fit for purpose.
Raf, an aspiration. Is this a good idea in an election campaign, or how should this be treated?
I've got an aspiration to have hair on my head and not just on my face. I know what the reality of that is. I think it's actually a pretty weird thing to raise. I don't want to keep on hammering the same point, but they came up with 2 things last Sunday that should have been out there a lot longer. There's the Lamington's back with different language, which is basically a tax bonus
the one-off tax
for
rate.
middle income owners. He wasn't talking about that. What he's talking about is trying to bring your marginal tax rates down, while he's also pledged on election night to put your marginal tax rate up.
Well, this is the point.
Pass a law to do it. That seems that is not a sign of a campaign with one message.
Labor argue this should be laughed out of town because they are saying they would put up personal income tax, the lowest tax rate for all Australians. It's not a lot, but they're going to reverse the cut that the government did. Claire, an aspiration then to index the tax rates down the track at some point. Is what they're taking to this election consistent with that?
I mean, I think they'll argue that it is. I just think it's absolutely ridiculous that we're talking about this at all, because why would you talk about a theoretical promise that's definitely not going to be happening in the coming term, regardless of who's in government, when you're a party that's promising to put $1,200 in some 6 million workers' pockets and then a bit less than that into another 4. I think this is a broader issue, and it's interesting that we're getting to this point already talking about it with 2 weeks still to go, of an issue of discipline with the way that Peter Dutton is engaging with the media, and that it may be great to have this sit-down interview where you talk about your broader vision for what you want to do with the tax system, but you've got 14 days or essentially left to convince people to put you in a position where you might even be able to then go forward and have aspirations. I think it just eats up another day where you're not talking about the things that you're putting in people's pockets.
To be devil's advocate for a minute, you could argue that it's refreshingly frank, that someone doesn't feel they have to make an absolute commitment. They can say, look, we'd like to, we're not going to promise because we're not sure. You could argue that. But I do think, in agreement with Clare and Raf, that part of the problem that the coalition has and Peter Dutton has is they keep chopping and changing, and so anything that looks like inconsistency or confusion or equivocation in the current context is probably not a good idea.
When you're behind in the polls, you have to win every single day and every single week. Even a draw is a loss at this point for the coalition, and that's the issue.
Just one thing on the actual idea. Malcolm Fraser did it. Yes. And I really hope John Howard isn't watching, because I hope I get my history right. Malcolm Fraser did do this, I think, in 76.
76.
So that drastically constrains the income coming into the government. That is one reason John Howard, as Treasurer, put an excise tax on petrol, because they weren't bringing enough money to make up for the shortfall.
And they ultimately undid it in 82, I think.
They undid it as well. So it does go to discipline. And it just goes to, if you're going to bring the Lamington back, talk about it. They rebadged it. It's the lower cost of living tax offset, I think, instead of lower.
Look, a few other things, just back on the debate, there were a few little moments that generated a fair bit of talk afterwards. Climate change, that answer from Peter Dutton, where he did seem a little unsure about the impact of climate change on severe weather events in Queensland. He later said, of course I believe the science. I was talking about, one particular weather event, but how did it come across?
I think the question was actually in a broader context than that. He answered in the broad initially, and I was surprised that he was not more definitive, and that he left open, oh, well, it's the scientists, I'm not I don't know. Like, I don't know is not the right answer to the questions you were asking. Yeah. But then I think he realised, and then he sort of narrowed his focus deliberately to Thargomindah in the events in Queensland, so that the wordier answer he had Thargomindah in it.
Does that talk to, though, his concern about where his own base is at on climate change still? Is that still an issue?
Well, it is among Liberals who voted for Teal independence, and there are seats where there are, beyond the ones that are already held by Teals, there are certainly seats.
But are there some on the right who don't want him saying,
of course,
we believe the science?
He's not helping someone like Tim Wilson. I mean, it does what it says on the tin, climate change. It changes the climate. I mean, that is the point. Whether you get a change in the weather, he should have a better answer. He has been able to paper over those divisions. But just to get to retail politics, it doesn't help someone like Tim Wilson. It doesn't help a seat like Bradfield in Sydney, where they're really under threat from Liberal, because Liberal voters want a different answer from Peter Dutton.
And Anthony Albanese, I think his most difficult moment was on power prices and when they're going to come down. And it's fascinating to contrast what we heard from him at the election 3 years ago, where it was a lot more definitive than this time.
Yeah, I think the issue is obviously the $150 extension of the rebate has a definitive end in December. So do the math on the typical, it's a bit back of the envelope, but if you do the math on the typical average household Australian bill, January 1, you're looking at that quarter being 14% more expensive, because that's the effect of that $75 a quarter rebate. So I think it's right that the PM is being asked repeatedly, well, is that the case? Like, are you confirming? When you go to the government or you go to the campaign headquarters, they'll give you a line saying, we've always said that where we can, we will do more, and we'll get to that bridge when we get to it. I did a bit of a call around of Labor caucus earlier this week, asking if expecting, to be honest, a lot of the backbench to sort of say, it's going to be untenable. Of course, we're going to have to extend that rebate. But in actual fact, there was much more like, well, let's see what we're at by then. There'll be more rate cuts. The household budgets will be in a different position. We're not having to rush to an election. There are no states coming up to a big election necessarily. So, I mean, it could be that he's not answering it, because the answer is yes, your bills are going to go up.
Also, the 275 thing definitely hurt them.
Yes.
Like, definitely hurt them, that promise. Yeah. However, that's been negated, because if there's any idea Labor's prosecuted, nuclear is really expensive. Yeah. So it means that power bill issue becomes a zero-sum game for Labor. So that is
you can point to that nuclear bill.
It's a big win for them.
And Raph, what about Donald Trump? Does anyone trust Donald Trump?
Well, I'm glad you used my question in the debate, if I can claim that. No, the only reason I mentioned that, I did ask both Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton at the start of the campaign. In fact, Anthony Albanese might have been a bit earlier. Do you trust Donald Trump? I got very different answers to the ones you got. When I asked the Prime Minister, I think he was a bit peeved, if I can use that word, and he said, what kind of question is that? He didn't want to be asked if he directly trusted the president of another country. He just said to you, yes. Peter Dutton, conversely, he gave you what I would consider to be a weak answer. When he answered that question with me, it was very strong. It was, be under no doubt. I will stand up to Donald Trump if I need to. He just didn't answer the question. It was a really good answer, and he gave a really poor response to you. So I'm not quite sure why they gave different. I guess they're allowed to give different answers to a really tough question, but I don't think Peter Dutton should have repeated the one he gave me.
I did enjoy that the PM said to you that he had no reason to distrust Trump at this stage, and all I could think as he said that was, well, yeah, he's been there like 6 months.
What time is it?
He trusts him? Like, does anybody trust Trump when they do a deal with him?
Just some general thoughts on where we're at. Well, just under 2 weeks to go. The polls, as I mentioned earlier, are pretty clear. You look at any one of them. They could be all completely wrong, but they're all telling us, Well, Karen, what are they telling us?
Well, they are suggesting swings to Labor, that things have firmed up for Labor. But beware the two-party preferred vote in this election. This is very much a seat-by-seat proposition, and Labor may have firmed its vote in seats that it already holds. So it's very hard to tell where that vote is. I think the trend suggests, if you look at all the polls are going in the same direction, you'd have to say the trend is it's firming for Labor. They're doing better. But just be careful in extrapolating that across the whole country, because there are wildcard issues and crazy contests in all kinds of seats. And I keep saying this, but you could see a lot of seats changing hands that don't necessarily represent the size of the change in the outcome. You know, that things could neutralise each other. You could see things happen in seats we haven't been watching. And the parties are doing their tracking polling, which is the better polling in terms of the seats, in particular seats. They're not tracking polling in every seat.
And just on, I mean, the coalition, you know, keep saying to me, coalition people, that their track poll is better than what the published polls say. I mean, they would say that, but anyway, it's...
One Labor minister said to me, I'm baffled by Dutton's incompetence, but still terrified that he will win. So I think that sums up where Labor feels they are.
Yeah. And the memory of 2019.
2019 is just trauma. I think also for my state, I am trying to push this line. We are the swing state. We might actually be the swing state this time. So I'm trying to get that language going. So please help me. But the Liberals and people in the coalition were very keen to say at the start of this year, look, 6 to 8 seats. They are not saying that they will now pick up 6 to 8 seats. They are now talking about 2 or 3 seats.
In Victoria. And
so they are feeling that significant momentum shift. And no one in the coalition will say to you, gee, our campaign's going like clockwork. No one will say.
Claire?
I think what's interesting talking to Labor is that they were bracing for a full court press. I think it's pretty fair to say, looking back on the last 3 years, they lost a fair few more weeks than they sort of won in the general contest of the two sides, particularly over that whole course of the referendum. But what they've been really astonished is that it's just sort of been Peter Dutton out in front and not much else. And he obviously, even though he's been a senior minister in a government for a very long time, is very different to being in a campaign environment. And he was always going to have wobbles, and I mean, we saw what happened to Anthony Albanese in 22. That's a given. So for him to be left so exposed, I think, has really surprised Labor, particularly with a lot of senior Libs being kind of iced out or self-selecting on the sidelines. You've got Andrew Hastie, who had a bit of an issue with what he thought about women in combat. He's to the side. You've got Jane Hume off to the side with work from home. Like, everyone is.
It's interesting. What about those Green seats? Those 3 seats: Brisbane, Ryan, Griffith. Labor pretty confident they'll get Brisbane off the Greens.
So I have a mea culpa from the last election. I think it was actually in the green room before insiders during the last campaign. Adam Bandt said to me, "We're going to win 3 seats in Queensland," and I didn't believe him. And I've had to apologise for not believing him. Now they are, you know, when you talk to them, they're confident. When you press them, they sort of go, well, look, we could be in trouble in 1, maybe, you know, like it's a bit unclear. I think the Liberals are sort of talking a big game in Ryan and Brisbane. The Labor Party is talking about all 3 of them. Maybe the Liberals could take 1 of those seats. Maybe Ryan is maybe the most vulnerable. Labor could maybe get Brisbane. I feel like Griffiths with Max Chandler-Mather is probably the safest of those seats.
Yeah, I think
the truth is, it's really hard to tell.
It is. And Ryan, though, and the Liberals' chances of getting that one back raises the question about the Liberals' chances of getting Teal seats back. So similar sort of demographics, right, in Sydney, Melbourne, and that's Green seat of Ryan. Raph, are the Liberals showing much effort in this campaign to take those seats back?
Oh, they're showing a lot of effort. I think they've got real problems in Kooyong with Amelia Hamer, who is a good challenger, is a good candidate for Monique Ryan, but when she says she's a renter, but then it actually turns out she owns 2 properties, one in London. It's not so much that there's anything wrong with owning property, but trying to pretend to be something that you are not. She's also got a connection to a trust fund. Jane Hume was outraged that I mentioned Amelia Hamer having a trust fund. It's not Amelia Hamer's fault, but hey, I'm a renter too is not the same as I'm just lucky to be a part of a trust fund. But in that seat, and also I would argue in Zoe Goldstein's seat, Tim Wilson's running hard.
Daniel seat of Goldstein.
Daniel seat of Goldstein. There's a lot of Tim Wilson billboards, but I don't think Peter Dutton's campaign is helping Tim Wilson. And the thing I would say too about the coalition, they doubled down really hard on anti-Semitism and on supporting a lot of the things that Israel's government in particular backed, and you mentioned there's a bit of a separation there between the Australian government and the Israeli government. I wouldn't be surprised I could be hung, drawn and quartered for this one because I could get this wrong. I'm not sure that Gaza or the Jewish vote is going to shift a seat.
And you think 6 months ago, none of us were saying that.
I am not convinced that those issues...
That's a very interesting observation. We'll come back for some final observations with Clare Armstrong, Raph Epstein and Karen Middleton in a moment. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm photographer Mike Bowers. I'm talking pictures this morning with the host of Saturday Evenings on ABC Local Radio, Mark Humphries, and a very warm welcome. How's your election?
Excuse me. An election is only, what, 5 weeks in this country, and yet it's too long.
Electile dysfunction?
I think that's right.
Wednesday night showed that a lot of the policy of the major parties is still up for debate. I can't say it set the world on fire.
You know, Albanese got through the whole thing without falling off the stage, and Dutton got through a whole hour without abandoning one of his policies.
It was a win-win. Yeah. Well, the cartoonists get more license to cut loose, and Mark Knight has got them coming in like wrecking balls, Putin and Trump. As Mr. Dutton, Prime Minister, if I could have your attention, please. He's drawn the silver fox here.
We've got the Russian bases and Trump tariffs. We didn't need that image.
I guess we should be thankful that Putin at least has trousers on.
Yeah.
I did love this, Matt Golding, the demise of majority government debate and couples therapy.
Peter, how does Anthony's attack on your lack of policies make you feel?
Yeah.
I quite like that David Speers at the end of the last debate did ask, would it really be the worst thing if the other guy won? Yeah, you keep saying he's going to be a disaster.
Would it really? Would it be though?
That's it.
Part debate, part therapy session.
Yeah, they learn a lot about themselves.
They're people too. Peter Dutton's all for tough talking, but he was rushing to judgment this week. It was a fairly sort of bold call on his behalf. The Russians are coming.
Well, he verbaled the Indonesian president, is what I've heard. Verbaled?
Apparently.
Yes.
Verbaled. Lovely Harry Bruce cartoon with the sky's falling in as he seems to be having something dumped on him here by a bird.
That's a bit much. That's a bit... We didn't...
Russian planes.
Don't
need that. It was a big call, though.
Of course.
Lovely Kathy Wilcox. And what's Albo doing about that national security threat as the Russian pigs seem to be flying around here?
Russian planes are the new African gangs, aren't they? Is that what it is? Don't go to any restaurants. Russian planes.
Well, Russian restaurants are probably okay.
They're all right.
Lovely Peter Brolman, who's harking back to the 50s, I suppose. Oh, right. There's no Reds under the bed, but there is a train wreck under your bed. He hasn't had the best of elections, would you think?
It hasn't been great. It hasn't been great. Can we call it?
Be bold.
Sure. Anthony Green, he's here for another 2 weeks, isn't he? Can he call it? Has Anthony Green called it yet?
I don't think he has. Housing has been a big issue during this election, and both of the parties are trying to drive their policies home. And I think Brett Lethbridge has captured it perfectly because they're the same. I mean, can you tell them apart? One's giving you a tax cut, one's helping you buy and going to buy with you. Like, who's who in the zoo?
What I thought was so interesting this week is that they both announced housing policies. Now, these policies are supposed to make housing more affordable. The experts have come out and said these policies will make housing more expensive. They won't do the one thing, Mike, that they're supposed to do. We're from the government and we're here to help.
Yeah.
No, we don't need your help. Step back.
Yeah. Yeah, I did love this one, Mark Knight. The election campaign has suddenly turned into an episode of The Block.
Suddenly? Do you remember when Scott Cam was the National Careers Ambassador?
Yes, I do.
I think it's been an episode of The Block for some time.
I do love the little motion things.
That's
here.
it. Yeah. They're really going at it.
Yeah. Elbo's really wielding the hammer. And
love the side eye from Dutton there. That's fantastic.
One good thing that promises that I think will probably be kept is that Harry Dutton's got a promise from his dad that he's going to help him buy a house.
He's had a win.
He's had a win. David Rowe's drawn this down on Struggle Street here. Not now, Mum. I mean, Gina, I'm working.
Please vote family to house in Kirribilli. Yeah.
Finally, we'll give the final word to Matt Golding. I think this is a poll we can all get behind. The Resolve poll found that if the election was held today, Australians would be happy.
I think that is absolutely true. I mean, I don't know how the Americans do a campaign that lasts a year. Like, we're 3 weeks in and we're done.
Well, mate, I'm not done with you. We could talk all day. However, we better bring it to an end. I'll let you do the honours.
Cheers, Mike. Back to you, David Speers.
Thank you, Mark Humphries. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Claire.
Well, it wouldn't be Easter without a bit of breakfast chocolate.
We did just scruff some eggs while talking pictures.
My observation is that pre-poll would obviously normally start tomorrow, Monday. We have 2 public holidays over this pre-poll period. It'd be interesting to see how that impacts the vote. But more importantly, if you are a normal Australian, then you're probably taking 3 days of annual leave, getting 10 days, far, far away from newspapers and TV and everything else, which I think will come to bear in the Liberal Party's review of this campaign, where they will say it was a mistake to leave everything so late to the campaign to announce, particularly given they've essentially lost the next 10 days of the campaign to people being in much nicer situations on holiday.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, although I'm sure everybody on holidays is watching Insiders.
Obviously.
Available on iView. Raf.
2 quick ones. The Liberal Party are shopping around dinners with Angus Taylor You don't need to pay the $5,000. How much would you like to pay? They're having trouble getting rid of those tickets. A broader observation about the shift away from the major parties. 20 years ago, the 2004 election, there were 89 seats won where they didn't go to preferences. 89, it's more than 2/3 of them. Last time it was just 13 seats that didn't go to preferences, just 13. We could have a federal election maybe where 5 seats or less are won by someone getting more than 50% of the primary vote. The shift away from the majors is on.
It's an exclusive club, the primary vote winners. Karen.
One of the most fascinating things about election campaigns is that every few days there's an unexpected thing, and there is a tension between the major party leaders and their campaigns and trying to plan an election campaign and make announcements on certain days, go to certain places, and logistics require you to do that. But there are things that happen of their own accord. And if you look at the last 3 weeks, we've seen them about every 3 or 4 days, some unexpected intervention, a mistake, something from overseas, something that happens. You need to be agile. You need to be able to shift your campaign planning. And I think the risk, particularly for the coalition, in constantly saying, later, 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 we'll tell you about that later, is that if something happens on the day you're planning to come out with your homelessness, women's domestic violence policy or whatever, that sends the public conversation in another direction, you've lost out. So it's going to be really interesting to see who can manage those unexpected events. We can expect 3 or 4 more in the next couple of weeks. Who manages them best and who gets their message out most clearly.
Indeed. Thank you all very much for joining us on this Easter Sunday morning. Really appreciate it. Next week, we're going to be live from one of the marginal seats that will decide whether government is going to change hands or not. Finally, I made a social media video this week, which is pretty cool for someone as bad at social media as me. I may have had a bit of help. But even better, the folks at The Feed made a parody of it. So we'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
This is an important podium.
This is my podium.
This is where we're going to be hosting the SBS Feeds political debate. Let me just show you the set.
We've got the 2 podiums here.
We've got 6 chairs here for the 6 leaders. Punters Politics will be sitting right here.
Very clean.
It's all very clean. We've got Freya and Joel over at this side.
They're not too far away from
each other.
It's just the 3 of us.
It's just the 10 of us here in the studio today covering what young people really care about this election. It's going to be very intimate.
It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to it.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.